The big house on the hill above Sunset Boulevard stood cold and hard against the starry sky. It was christened Greystone and looked like it had been there for 100 years. But like everything in the City of Angels, it wasn't what it seemed, and the house was not so much a home as it was a fortress holding secrets. Across town at 2 a.m., Leslie White, a new member of the LA District Attorney's Special Investigations Unit, was awakened by his boss, Lucian Wheeler. He was ordered to get to Greystone Mansion as fast as he could. He was told that Ned Doheny, lord of the manor and son of oil tycoon E.L. Doheny, was killed by his secretary, who then took his own life. He didn't need to be told how big a deal it was. Everyone knew that Doheny Sr. was one of the richest men in the country and whose influence ran deep. For most of the 20s, the old man had been caught up in the biggest government scandal to hit the country, and his son and the secretary were in the middle of it too. When White reached the gates of Greystone, he found the mansion surrounded by heavily armed private security guards. They escorted him up to the house, where a uniformed butler greeted him as if he had arrived at a formal soiree. Waiting inside was his boss, Chief Wheeler, who was there on behalf of Buron Fitz, LA's freshly minted DA. White was taken to the south guest room, where the body of the secretary lay in the hall near the doorway, and the body of Doheny was laid out inside the room. The young investigator was new to the city, but he understood he was stepping into an occupational minefield. It was supposed to be an open and shut case, but what he uncovered has left lingering questions and has been fodder for tales of LA noir ever since. Come walk with me through the empty halls of Greystone and to the silent graves of those who were witness to the mysterious death of Ned Doheny. On February 16th, Ned Doheny's personal assistant, Hugh Plunkett, arrived at Greystone at around 9:30 p.m. He parked his automobile near the garage and walked toward the mansion and let himself in with his own key. The night watchman didn't give it a second thought, as Plunkett was a familiar sight at the estate and was probably running a late errand for Mr. Doheny. But nothing was routine about this visit. Friends and associates later told how Plunkett began showing increasing signs of nervousness and anxiety over the last few months. Many, including Ned, feared he was nearing a total nervous collapse. Ned's concern prompted him and his wife to persuade Hugh to check into a sanitarium where he would get the help he needed. Although Plunkett's presence at Greystone wasn't unusual, it nonetheless must have been a surprise to Ned and Lucy when he appeared in their bedroom acting nervous and upset. The couple were dressed for bed, and their 5 children, ranging in age from 13 to 2 years old, were already asleep in their rooms. Not wishing to impose on his wife or wake the children, Ned invited Plunkett to speak in the downstairs south guest room. Aside from the outcome, there is very little known about what transpired next. What is known is that the men drank and smoked as they talked, presumably about Plunkett's nervous condition. Eventually, the conversation grew heated, and around 10 p.m., Ned placed a call to the home of Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh, the family's personal physician, requesting his assistance with his sick friend. Doheny's message found the doctor at the Hollywood Playhouse, where he was attending a play with his wife. Leaving immediately, he reached Greystone at 11 o'clock and met Lucy at the front door. She filled him in on what was happening, saying she had just heard a loud noise like a heavy piece of furniture had fallen over. They reached the end of the west hall, where a door leading to the guest apartments hung partially open. There was a quick movement from within, and Hugh Plunkett, looking pale and gaunt, rushed out and ordered them to leave. Then, just as quickly, he retreated, slamming the door behind him. As the doctor and Lucy traded bewildered glances, the sharp crack of a pistol rang out. Holding his breath, Dr. Fishbaugh opened the door and was confronted by the motionless body of Hugh Plunkett on the hall floor, just outside of the guest room. Inside the room, he found Doheny lying on his back beside an overturned chair. A dark halo of blood pooled around his head. Dr. Fishbaugh knelt beside him and tried to find a pulse. Just then, Lucy appeared in the doorway. She was known for her fortitude, but in that terrible moment she became hysterical. With the aid of the night watchman, the doctor persuaded her to go to her room. Across town, Edward Doheny Sr. was fast asleep at his Chester Place residence when a call came in just after midnight informing him of the tragedy. Minutes later, his chauffeur-driven car was speeding toward Beverly Hills. Arriving at Greystone, he silently stepped into the carnage. Of all the hardships, setbacks, and scandals he ever faced in his eventful life, this was the only one that brought him to his knees. The great oil man looked small and weak as he sat beside the body of his only son. He helplessly stroked his lifeless hands and repeated the words, "My boy, my boy." In February 1929, Edward Lawrence Doheny Sr. was a millionaire 100 times over. He was long removed from his hardscrabble beginnings when he struggled to eke out a living in the unyielding and violent regions where he acquired a taste for the wealth that comes out of the earth. Born in Wisconsin in 1856, Doheny was the son of Irish Catholic immigrants. Leaving home at age 17, he developed a hard, some would say ruthless personality that was forged in the mining camps of South Dakota and the New Mexico and Arizona territories. In 1882, he settled in Kingston, New Mexico, where he mined silver in the Black Range Mountains. During his sojourn, he made 3 acquaintances that would have a dramatic impact on his life. The first was Charles Canfield, a fellow miner who would one day lure him west to California and give him a $400 stake to drill for oil in Los Angeles. The second was a brash, dark-eyed Kentuckian who liked to play cards and had on occasion settled arguments with a gun. His name was Albert Fall, who traded mining for a life in politics, becoming a United States Senator for the new state of New Mexico, and was later appointed Secretary of the Interior by President Warren G. Harding. The third acquaintance was a girl named Carrie Wilkins, who was described as a spirited, brown-haired beauty. She worked in the Kingston boarding house where Doheny was living. The couple married in 1883, and their first years together were marked by frequent moves driven by rising and declining fortunes. The following year, Edward and Carrie welcomed a baby girl they named Eileen. Eileen was adored by her parents, but she was a sickly child. The Dohenys hoped that her health would improve after moving to the more salubrious climate of Southern California. But tragically, Eileen passed away shortly after her 8th birthday. She was buried at Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. A year later, a second child was born, a boy named Edward Lawrence after his father, although everyone took to calling him Ned. By then, Doheny's fortunes had changed for the better. He had completed drilling an oil well in Los Angeles that was producing nearly 40 barrels a day. He had entered into a partnership with his old friend Charles Canfield, and over the ensuing years they sunk hundreds of wells in the area. By the turn of the century, they began expanding operations into Mexico. Although Doheny had attained success in business, there were, however, growing problems at home. From the beginning of their relationship, Carrie Doheny suffered severe mood swings and depression. These periods only worsened after the death of Eileen. Stories of her illness found their way into the press, and although the articles did not elaborate on the exact nature or cause of her condition, there were rumors that she was an alcoholic. In 1891, a cash-strapped Doheny was forced to borrow money to send Carrie to a hospital in El Paso. Though in ruins, the Dohenys' marriage endured for 16 years, until without warning, Carrie took Ned and moved to Oakland, California. Within a few months, she filed for divorce. Edward did not challenge the decree. By then, his oil business was booming, and the following year he met a young telephone operator named Carrie Estelle Betzold. She came from humble origins but was possessed of wit and self-confidence. She was 24 and he was 43. But despite the differences in their ages, once they fell into each other's orbit, there was no going back. In August 1900, after a courtship of 3 months, Edward Doheny and Carrie Betzold were married. Because his bride shared the same given name as his ex-wife, Edward preferred to address her by her middle name, which was Estelle. Biographer Margaret Davis noted that she happily accepted this. However, when she was displeased with her husband, usually for his long absences, she signed her letters to him as Carrie. Meanwhile, in Oakland, Edward's ex-wife was outwardly trying to start a new life as a single mother, but inwardly she was being suffocated by spells of depression so dark that she often felt she was drowning in an ocean of black crude. On September 27, 1900, a month after Edward had remarried, she ingested a vial of battery acid she had procured from an apothecary. After hours spent in intense agony, Carrie Luella Wilkins was gone. She was 38. Her tragic death was reported as accidental, noting that the bottle of poison looked identical to those containing her medicine. But anyone close to the unfortunate woman knew it was no accident. After receiving word of her death, Edward had her body brought back to Los Angeles and buried it beside their daughter Eileen at Evergreen Cemetery. Doheny rarely, if ever, spoke of her again, and her memory receded around him like a noon shadow. Even Ned, now returned to his father, shunned the woman who gave him life and instead gravitated to the maternal affections of a gentle and kind stepmother, whom he called Mommy. Leslie White was a man with a moral code and a strict sense of righteousness. It made him a rare breed in the City of Angels, but what he did have in common with most people in LA was that he came from somewhere else. He emigrated from Canada when he was a boy. Through his teen years, he worked at odd jobs until age 20 when he settled in Ventura County. The simple fact that he owned a horse landed him a job in the Ranger Service. He mainly protected hunting preserves, but it was his first work in law enforcement. From there, he became a county deputy, but manhandling vagrants and drunks was not the career choice White had in mind, and it wasn't long before he quit and took up photography. It was as a photographer he documented one of the worst man-made disasters in California history. Just before midnight on March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam gave way, unleashing a torrent of death that claimed more than 400 lives. In the aftermath of the disaster, Leslie White was hired to photograph the victims in order to aid identification. His work caught the attention of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, and the rest, as they say, is history. By the time White arrived at Greystone, the DA and the LA Sheriff's Department had taken charge of the crime scene. 3, maybe 4 hours had elapsed since the shooting. The Dohenys waited nearly 2 hours before informing the Beverly Hills Police Department of what happened. The delay, it was explained, was so that the family could compose themselves before the story broke. While sheriff's deputies interviewed witnesses, White set about reconstructing the events based on physical evidence. He described what he saw in his 1936 autobiography, Me, Detective.
In a luxurious bedroom lay the corpse of Doheny, clad only in his underwear and a silk bathrobe. There was a hole through his skull from ear to ear, and he lay on his back. Blood was crisscrossed in a crazy pattern over his finely chiseled face.
The young investigator was no stranger to death, but in this instance, the intimacy and immediacy of the tragedy hit him with a deep sense of melancholy that he could not fathom. He was accustomed to finding scenes of such violence among the dregs of society and in back alleys and seedy dope dens, not in the palatial homes of wealthy and refined people. White told himself that there would be time to brood over it later, but right now he had work to do. Then he moved on to the body of Hugh Plunkett.
He lay in the doorway less than 12 feet from young Doheny, spread-eagled on his stomach, his face in a pool of blood that welled from a hole in his head. There was a smudge on the ivory-tinted wall where fragments of brain had splattered, and the rug beneath his feet had been shoved sideways as he slumped in death.
Then came the arduous and careful task of measuring, photographing, and collecting evidence that included cigarette butts, a whiskey bottle, and several glasses. Finally, he described a crucial piece of evidence, noting one strange detail in particular.
After fingerprinting both bodies, I rolled Plunkett and found a Bisley model .45 caliber Colt revolver. The gun was quite warm to the touch. I wrapped it carefully so as not to injure any latent fingerprints.
The faint light of dawn glowed in the east as Leslie White concluded his investigation at Greystone. He reviewed the witness statements that were so similar he had the feeling they had been coached on what to say. No one claimed to have seen the shooting take place, but everyone agreed that Plunkett arrived at the mansion, went mad, murdered his benefactor, then turned the gun on himself. Furthermore, the statements didn't jive with the physical evidence, especially where it concerned the crime scene. Witnesses said that they entered the room after hearing the second shot, and after seeing the bodies, retreated immediately without disturbing anything. White's instincts told him that something was wrong, but he knew what was at stake. The Dohenys weren't only one of the richest and most influential families in the country, they had an iron grip on LA's legal and political apparatus. And what made the situation a powder keg was the fact that the late heir apparent and his secretary were mixed up in the Teapot Dome affair, the greatest corruption scandal to rock the country during the Jazz Age. White couldn't help but wonder if that somehow played a part in this, but he kept those thoughts to himself for now.
Apparently, the other investigators were satisfied with the setup, so I decided to say nothing about it until I developed some concrete proof.
The other question on his mind was, who was Hugh Plunkett, and how did a nobody like him manage to get in so tight with the Dohenys? This was a huge deal, and White couldn't, as he put it, go off half-cocked. Chief Wheeler, perhaps sensing White's doubts or reacting to his own keen instincts, told his investigator to accompany the bodies to the morgue and to, quote, keep digging. Theodore Hugh Plunkett was born in Illinois on the 28th of March, 1896. His family settled in Los Angeles when he was 12. As a teenager, he found work as an auto mechanic at a gas station owned by William Henry Smith. Smith's daughter was Lucy Marceline, who was engaged to Ned Doheny. What Hugh lacked in formal education, he made up for with mechanical skills, and he was trusted to use his talent to keep Ned's fancy automobiles in top-running condition. Everything Ned did in his early life was meant to prepare him to be the future head of the Doheny oil empire. He was educated in the best parochial schools, then attended Stanford and the University of Southern California. Despite having vastly different backgrounds, Ned and Hugh formed a close friendship that was cemented with his invitation to Ned and Lucy's wedding in June 1914. When Ned graduated from USC, he joined his father's company, bringing Plunkett with him as his chauffeur. Hugh looked up to Ned, who was 2 years older, and patterned his life after his. Upon America's entry in the First World War, Hugh and Ned enlisted in the Navy on the same day. After the war, life picked up where it left off for the millionaire's son and his chauffeur. According to the 1920 census, Hugh was married to Harriet Hall, and his occupation was auto mechanic at a repair shop. In that same year, Ned was on the board of directors of his father's oil operations in Mexico. The company's wells south of the border produced over 1 million barrels of oil a month, and throughout the decade yielded a profit of over $100 million, roughly $2 billion today. It was the beginning of what promised to be a golden era, and Ned didn't forget Hugh. He gave him a greater role in his life by promoting him to his personal secretary and assistant. The two became practically inseparable. Hugh often traveled with Ned on business and even joined the Dohenys on family vacations. The long absences from home put a heavy strain on the Plunkett's marriage. Harriet filled her alone time by dabbling in the various new religious movements that were gaining in popularity on the West Coast. One of the many business trips involving Hugh occurred in November 1921 and would have fateful consequences. It began when E.L. Doheny Sr. agreed to loan $100,000, nearly $2 million today, to an old friend and associate in Washington, D.C. He asked Ned to handle the arrangements and to personally deliver the loan in cash. A few days after Thanksgiving, Ned and Hugh were on a train headed east. They stopped first in New York City on November 29th, where Ned withdrew the money from his personal account at Blair & Company Investment Bank. In an almost cinematic twist, the bundles of cash were wrapped in plain brown paper and transferred in a leather satchel. Then, from Penn Station, Ned and Hugh boarded a train bound for Washington, D.C. The meetup was at the Wardman Park Hotel, where in a room on the 7th floor they were greeted by the recipient of the loan, Albert Fall, the same brash, dark-eyed Kentuckian the elder Doheny befriended during his mining days in New Mexico. Now Fall was serving as President Harding's Secretary of the Interior. Fall gave Ned a promissory note for the loan, and the three men spent the next few hours drinking and making small talk. Within 24 hours, Ned and Hugh were back in New York City, and Secretary Fall, with cash in hand, was on his way to his New Mexico ranch. It was the kind of arrangement that those involved believed they would never have to think about again. At 10 a.m., Les White was on the phone at his lab in LA's Hall of Justice, giving Lucian Wheeler the findings of his all-night investigation. When he finished, there was a pause on the line. Then his boss instructed him to make tracks to the DA and tell him the news right away. As Les walked to the parking lot, he passed a newsstand and found the story of the Doheny murder splashed across the front pages of all the LA papers. And it seemed that every one of them gave a version of the trumped-up story told by the witnesses at Greystone Mansion, a story that he knew was false. He was about to have his first one-on-one meeting with Buron Fitz, whom he only knew by reputation or from what he read in the papers. Fitz was a war hero who served as an infantry officer. Half of his right knee was shot off during the Battle of the Argonne, and for a decade thereafter he endured a series of painful surgeries that ended with the amputation of his leg. After the military, he entered politics and ran successfully as California's lieutenant governor. In 1928, he resigned from the office to take on the role of special prosecutor in the bribery case against LA's sitting district attorney and his former mentor, Asa Keys. Simultaneously, Fitz ran for Keyes' old office and was elected in November 1928. It was the beginning of a long, colorful career, pockmarked with controversy. White later summed him up this way.
He was forceful and filled with a mixture of idealism and practicality. Few people really knew Buron Fitz, for his personality changed in direct ratio to the number of people in his presence. I liked him best when I met him alone.
White was tired and irritable when he arrived at the DA's home in the hills above Sunset Boulevard and didn't waste any time getting straight to the point.
I don't believe Hugh Plunkett killed Doheny, then committed suicide. Or if he did, it couldn't have happened in the manner described by witnesses.
Fitz listened as White described the bodies of Ned and Hugh.
In examining the corpse of Doheny, I observed that there were powder burns around the bullet hole in his head, proving the gun was held less than 3 inches away at the moment it was fired. There were no such markings on Plunkett's head.
White reported that when he discovered the Colt revolver under Plunkett's body, it was unusually hot.
I fired the Colt many times and it did not heat up to any noticeable extent.
Nor could the heat have been transferred from Plunkett's steadily cooling body. It left him to speculate that someone must have intentionally warmed the gun, possibly to give the impression that the shooting took place at a later time than it actually did. But there was yet another puzzling fact about the revolver.
There wasn't any evidence of fingerprints on the gun at all. Even a heavily oiled gun will bear smudges or unreadable prints on the steel, but the Colt was wiped clean.
In contrast, the liquor bottle and glasses all bore the fingerprints of Doheny and Plunkett, proving they'd been drinking together up to the time of the shooting. The other details that troubled White were the discrepancies between the physical evidence and the witness testimony. According to Dr. Fishbaugh, as he and Lucy Doheny approached the guest room, Plunkett rushed forward, ordering them to leave in a threatening manner, slammed the door, then moments later fired a bullet into his brain. White then laid out photos of Plunkett's lifeless left hand, still holding a half-burned cigarette.
It would have been impossible for him to manage all that in a highly nervous state while holding a gun in his right hand and a cigarette in his left, as the doctor said.
White said that nearly every witness heard 2 gunshots happening several minutes apart. However, a maid said there were 3 shots fired rapidly within the span of a second. He noted that the Bisley model Colt is a single-action firearm, meaning that the hammer must be cocked before it could be fired. White added that Plunkett was alleged to have shot Doheny from across the room while they were both seated in chairs, and although it's not impossible to rapid-fire 3 shots from a single-action revolver, only an expert could do so with any accuracy. Buron Fitz listened to everything White had to say before addressing the elephant in the room. If Plunkett didn't kill Doheny, who did? White said that it would take a lot of serious digging to find out, but the one man they needed to lean on was Dr. Fishbaugh. Not only was he the Doheny family's personal physician, but it seemed he was also their spokesman in this matter. He had already given an interview to the LA Times where he laid out the scenario of the crime being committed by a secretary gone mad. White already knew that the doctor gave false statements to the police and the press, and he could prove it. But first he wanted to test the new DA's resolve by stating boldly,
I understand that some people believe the Doheny family are too influential to tamper with.
Fitz snapped back immediately. There isn't a man in the United States big enough to stop me from conducting a criminal investigation. Harkening back to his days as an Army lieutenant, the flushed DA called his office and gave the order to have Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh brought to his office at the Hall of Justice within the hour. A few months after Ned and Hugh delivered Albert Fall's loan, Doheny's Pan American Petroleum Company was granted no-bid leases to drill on the United States Naval Petroleum Reserves in Elk Hills, California. At the same time, Fall also received money from Harry Sinclair of Sinclair Oil, who was granted similar leases in the Teapot Dome oil fields of Wyoming. All of the leases were issued by the Interior Department. Prior to these transactions, Albert Fall was nearly broke. Lenders were threatening to foreclose on his New Mexico ranch until practically overnight he began spending vast sums of money, and it didn't go unnoticed. In Washington, people began making inquiries about the source of his sudden windfall. Within 2 years, storm clouds had gathered around the Interior Secretary, and on February 17, 1923, he abruptly resigned and released a cryptic statement comparing the lives of public servants to those of Christian martyrs. 2 weeks later, the United States Senate launched its first investigation into the leases in what would become the Teapot Dome scandal. It brought more unwanted scrutiny on Warren G. Harding's presidency that was already beleaguered by charges of corruption. With the prospect of another looming scandal, Harding was asked how he handled his enemies, to which he famously quipped,
I can take care of my enemies. It's my friends who keep me pacing the floor at night.
Later that summer, with his presidency in ashes, Harding died unexpectedly while on the West Coast. In many ways, he was spared from what was coming. At the start, Fall had been careful to cover his tracks, and investigators couldn't find any hard evidence of wrongdoing. Behind the scenes, E.L. Doheny urged Fall to get ahead of the controversy by admitting to the loan. Doheny would back him by testifying that it was an innocent transaction between two very old and very close friends. But Fall, being more politically savvy, doubted the ploy would work and ignored his friend's counsel. Frustrated, E.L. Doheny penned a letter to the committee explaining that he was merely helping a friend in need and that the loan in no way had any influence on obtaining the Elk Hills leases. But rather than ameliorate the scandal, the letter acted like a lightning rod, giving the committee the evidence it needed to expand its investigation and pursue criminal charges. Eventually, Fall, Doheny Sr., and Ned were indicted for conspiracy and bribery. The first trial came in late 1926. The elder Doheny and Albert Fall were tried for conspiracy, and after a short jury deliberation, they were both acquitted. It was a victory, but a cascade of civil lawsuits against Pan American Petroleum followed and threatened to overwhelm the company. One such civil action resulted in the cancellation of the Elk Hills leases on the grounds they were obtained fraudulently. The decision was later upheld by the Supreme Court. Furthermore, it forced Pan American Petroleum to pay a substantial restitution. On top of all this, Doheny still faced a charge for bribery, the outcome of which was uncertain. However, as 1926 drew to a close, E.L. Doheny wanted to end the year on a positive note, and for Christmas he made the gift of a new home for Ned and his family. He carved out a large portion of his ranch in Beverly Hills, where the most fabulous private residence in the country would soon rise. Construction lasted 18 months and no expense was spared. They hired famed architect Gordon Kaufman to design the 55-room, 46,000-square-foot mansion in the Tudor Revival style. It was built of reinforced steel and concrete, then faced with Indiana limestone and topped with Welsh slate, giving the house its name, Greystone. The massive interior spaces were accented with hand-carved oak and inlaid marble. Outside, the grounds included a gatehouse, terraced gardens, tennis court, swimming pool, garage, and stables. The property even had its own fire station. When completed, the construction costs exceeded $3 million, roughly $60 million in today's money. Ned and Lucy and their 5 children officially moved in November 1928, where they celebrated their first, and as fate would have it, their only Christmas together at Greystone. Building Greystone was a mammoth project, and overseeing it all was Hugh Plunkett. It affirmed the faith and trust that Ned placed in his secretary. In exchange, Hugh worked long hours, rarely going home to his wife. It was the final straw in his crumbling marriage, and in August 1927, the couple officially separated. A little over a year later, Harriet was granted a divorce on the grounds of desertion. When Ned was handed the keys to Greystone, Hugh was, by some accounts, near collapse. Juggling the responsibilities to his employer while navigating through a divorce had taken a physical and mental toll. But there was something else weighing on his mind. As 1928 drew to a close, E.L. Doheny's trial for bribery loomed large, and the outlook wasn't as optimistic as the first trial. Teapot Dome had been dragging on for 5 years, and the government was demanding its pound of flesh. The indictment against Ned had been dropped, and he was given immunity for testifying in the conspiracy trial against Harry Sinclair. The government had thus far not called upon Hugh Plunkett to testify for his part as bagman for Albert Fall's alleged bribe. But Doheny's lawyers warned that he would most likely be subpoenaed early in the new year. It seemed like the prosecution had been saving him as their ace in the hole. Quietly, the family was preparing for the worst. The possibility of everything hinging on how well Hugh did on the witness stand was overwhelming, and while Ned had complete faith in him, the elder Doheny was reluctant to put the future of his empire in the hands of his son's chauffeur. The pressure was enormous, and Hugh began to feel increasingly isolated and panic-stricken. Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh strode into Burr & Fitz's office like a prize stallion. Wearing a finely tailored suit, he could have easily passed for a Hollywood leading man. He was 44 years old, handsome, broad-shouldered, and stood over 6 feet tall. His dark hair, combed in a wave, had streaks of gray at the temples, and his blue, bespectacled eyes were warm and engaging. He was from Indiana and had earned his medical degree at Johns Hopkins before setting up a practice in L.A. He was a doctor to many powerful and influential people that not only included the Dohenys, but many glamorous movie stars like Mabel Normand, Jean Harlow, and Dolores Del Rio. The doctor took a seat opposite the district attorney, resting his black felt Homburg on his lap. Present at the meeting were Lucian Wheeler and Leslie White. Fitz thanked him for coming and said there were a few loose ends that needed to be tied up and promised not to take up too much of his time. With the pleasantries out of the way, he handed the doctor off to his investigator. Leslie White got right down to business. He inquired if he was present at the time of the shooting. The doctor nodded his head and said that he was. White asked how much time had passed from when he heard the gunshot until he entered the guest room. The doctor said it was only a few seconds after. White asked if Doheny was dead when he found him. He was, the doctor said, nodding affirmatively. White followed up, wanting to know if the body had been disturbed in any way. Dr. Fishbaugh shifted in his seat and answered that the body had not been disturbed. The investigator's heart raced. He set the trap, now he was about to spring it. He placed a series of photos on the desk showing Ned lying on his back with his face covered in blood.
Then, doctor, as an experienced physician, will you kindly explain how blood could run up from the ears and cross back and forth over the face of a man who never moved off his back?
The doctor hesitated, and for a moment the confident air he demonstrated moments ago was gone. He knew he was caught. He glanced at the photos, giving himself a moment to gather his thoughts. Then, in a weak, almost timid voice, he admitted that of course it can't. And what he had neglected to say before was that Mr. Doheny was found lying on his face, but was still alive and had lived for approximately 20 minutes after the shooting. During that time, they had picked him up, then replaced him on the floor. White glanced over at Fitz, whose jaw was clenched, his face reddening. It had only taken him a minute to prove that the doctor had lied. Fishbaugh twisted in his seat, his fingers nervously playing across the brim of his Homburg. The DA was clearly angry, but he deferred to his investigator to see if he had anything further he wanted to ask. White said he was satisfied. Dr. Fishbaugh made a hurried exit, foregoing the same courtly air that he entered with. When he was gone, Fitz slammed his fist on the desk. "Do you believe that arrogant son of a bitch?" the DA said as he stood up. "How do you forget to mention that the victim is still breathing and that they picked him up off the floor?" Fitz paced his office like a bull. "If he lied about that," he said, "what else is he lying about?" He raised his hand and pointed at White and Wheeler. "Gentlemen, there's going to be a sweeping investigation, and so help me, I will get to the truth if I have to tear the roof off Greystone Mansion." Late Monday afternoon, some 36 hours after the shooting, Burr & Fitz called a press conference at the Hall of Justice. Present with him was the L.A. County Deputy Coroner, William McDonald. Leslie White stood with a dozen or more attending reporters. He was satisfied he had done a good job, and he was eager to hear how the DA's more experienced investigators built on his work. Fitz introduced Coroner McDonald, who announced that Edward Lawrence Doheny, Jr. had been shot and killed instantly by Theodore Hugh Plunkett. The bullet, fired from a distance of 6 feet, entered the victim's left temple and exited the opposite side of his head and embedded in the adjacent wall. In describing Plunkett's death, he said the muzzle of the antique revolver was held so tightly against his head when fired that it didn't leave powder marks on his skin, but that there was significant powder residue found on the inside of his skull. Leslie White was stunned. He watched the reporters dutifully take down the information in their notepads without question or comment. The coroner then moved on to a report from the county chemist about the contents of both men's stomachs. He found 16.9 grams of alcohol in Plunkett's stomach, while Doheny's had no traces of alcohol whatsoever. Fitz said that the evidence proved that Doheny was murdered by his secretary, who was suffering from an acute temporary insanity before ending his own life. The County of Los Angeles had issued the death certificates, and as the suspect was deceased, there was no need for a coroner's inquest. With that, he declared that the investigation into the death of Ned Doheny was summarily closed. White thought he was in a waking nightmare. He had just listened to the DA and the coroner spin the same yarn he heard at Greystone. The coroner was wrong about the powder burns, wrong about the details of the shooting, wrong about the drinking. Furthermore, nothing was said about the absence of fingerprints on the gun, or why it was so hot, or how Plunkett managed to kill Doheny, threaten two people, then shoot himself while holding a cigarette. There was no mention of Dr. Fishbaugh's conflicting testimony. After his interview at the DA's office, the physician told his tale to the newspapers, adding another wrinkle he failed to mention to cops. He alleged that for several months Hugh was taking Veronal, a barbiturate used to treat insomnia and was known to be highly addictive. He said he was combining that with another drug for anxiety and panic disorders. But White knew the doctor was a cool liar. Fishbaugh could explain everything except how Plunkett went from being a trusted, loyal pal one day to a homicidally insane pill popper the next. And the newspapers ate it all up without question, and none of them seemed interested to know what Plunkett's grieving family had to say. White couldn't say that he hadn't been warned. A few veteran cops told him that old man Doheny was too big, too powerful to tamper with, but he'd been beguiled when the mere suggestion of this to Fitz made him go apoplectic. But just like himself, the DA was young and new to his job. White guessed that sometime in the last 24 hours, Buron Fitz got a lesson about who he really works for. He learned what the cops, politicians, and newspapermen already knew. Of course, it was all a sham, but they all had to live in Doheny's world. And in his world, the old man's oil wells pump millions of dollars out of the ground every day, so naturally he gets to call the shots. In 48 hours, the story would completely disappear from the headlines, like it had never happened. All that was left to do was bury the dead. Ned Doheny's funeral took place on Tuesday, February 19, 1929. It was held at St. Vincent's Church, located quite literally in the front yard of the elder Doheny's Chester Place homestead. Funded and built by the oil man as a gift to the Catholic Church, it was cynically referred to by some as Doheny's fire escape, alluding that it was his attempt to buy passage into heaven. Crowds swarmed onto the corner of West Adams and Figueroa Street. When Ned's casket was brought in, police had to clear a path through the mass of people. It was as if they had come to pay their final respects to a head of state or to a movie star. Services commenced at 10 a.m. By then, every pew was filled and people stood in the aisles 4 and 5 deep. All eyes followed 72-year-old E.L. Doheny as he walked behind Ned's casket, clinging to the arm of an attendant. The oil magnate's pace was slow and careful, his body bowed as if under the strain of a great weight. It was reported that he'd been near death since hearing of his son's murder. His wife Estelle walked beside him. She would be his sole source of strength through the time he had left. Ned's wife, Lucy, her face hidden behind a veil, was heard softly sobbing as she bravely made her way up the central aisle. Her 5 children followed, their pitiful faces contorted in expressions of grief and looks of shock as they wrestled to comprehend all that had happened to them over the last 48 hours. The eulogy was given by Father O'Malley, who said that Ned departed this life with all that it held forth to him, making his a bitter death. He spoke of Ned's devotion to his family, and perhaps in a nod to his relationship with Hugh, of the goodness and humanity he had for all. Then Father O'Malley added that a bitter death would not be the end of Ned's story, that through his faith he will live yet again to be reunited in glory with those he left behind. Church bells rang as the funeral mass ended. Then the cortege with police escort motored 9 miles to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale for a private burial. He would be laid to rest beneath a marble canopy that once stood over the altar in the Basilica of Santa Sabina in Rome. Reputed to be over 400 years old, the sarcophagus was said to have contained the bones of the martyred Saint Sabina. The structure was acquired in 1926 by Dr. Hubert Eaton, the founder of Forest Lawn, and the following year it was erected in a prominent spot within his memorial park. Owing to its artistic and historic importance, E.L. Doheny purchased it as a resting place for his only son. At the family's request, the grave would remain unmarked. After the mourners left, Ned's heavy bronze casket was placed in the empty marble sarcophagus, but he would not be alone for long. In the coming weeks, E.L. Doheny had the remains of Ned's mother Carrie and his sister Eileen removed from Evergreen Cemetery and laid to rest beside him. It was the first time in nearly 30 years that he publicly acknowledged his first wife. Just down the crest of the slope where the temple of St. Sabina stood, a grave was being prepared for Theodore Hugh Plunkett. Just as Ned and Hugh had been close in life, so they would be in death. His funeral took place the following day at a mortuary chapel on Washington Avenue in L.A. It was supposed to be a private event, attended only by family and friends. But just like with Doheny, hundreds of curious spectators showed up. They wanted to see the mysterious secretary's family, hoping that through them they might gain some insight on who he was and what might have driven him to commit so desperate an act. They consisted of his parents, Charles and Clara Bell, and 3 siblings, Charles Jr., the eldest, and Robert and Isabel, who were younger. Instead, what people found were 5 shattered souls clinging to one another for strength, and who were just as in want of answers as everyone else. Hugh's ex-wife Harriet was there, although she did not stand with the rest of the family. Perhaps the biggest surprise of all was the presence of Lucy Doheny's 2 brothers who acted as pallbearers. They'd been close to Hugh in happier times before Doheny, when he worked in their father's gas station. And that wasn't all. Hugh's casket was adorned with a massive floral arrangement. Their fragrance filled the air of the modest chapel. They'd been sent by the Doheny family in a gesture of forgiveness and understanding that Hugh was not responsible for his actions, that they were motivated by illness rather than malice. At the gravesite, mourners negotiated the incline of Sunrise Slope where Hugh was to be buried. The services were conducted by Reverend Dr. George Davidson of St. John's Church. He concluded his brief sermon by saying that it was not for us to condemn, for Hugh was merely the instrument of a higher purpose, a purpose that was beyond mortal man's capacity to understand. As the last of the mourners and spectators departed, a hush settled over God's Acre. As far as the Doheny family, the press, and law enforcement were concerned, the matter was closed. But like restless spirits with unfinished business in the earthly realm, the questions did not stay buried for long. After burying his son, E.L. Doheny spent the next year preparing to defend himself on charges of bribery. Perhaps out of deference to the tragedy, the government postponed his court date, but the delay gave him little respite. In October 1929, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify in Albert Fall's trial. It was his hope that an acquittal for the former Interior Secretary would nullify the indictment against him. But it wasn't to be. Albert Fall was convicted of receiving bribes in exchange for oil leases at Elk Hills and Teapot Dome. Outraged by the verdict, Doheny lashed out in the press. The jury didn't try the case, he said. The judge tried it. Fall was sentenced to 1 year in prison and ordered to pay a $100,000 fine. After his appeal was denied by the Supreme Court in 1931, he began serving his sentence. He was released after 9 months and never paid the fine. E.L. Doheny's trial began in March 1930. It would be the government's last big push to get a conviction in the near-decade-old Teapot Dome scandal. The real drama came toward the end of the 3-week trial when the oil magnate testified in his own defense. In almost mythic fashion, he recounted the story of his early life as a miner on up to his success in the oil business and ending on the infamous loan. He said he only took on the Elk Hills lease for patriotic reasons. He was grilled for hours on cross-examination. It was pointed out that if he was motivated only by patriotism, then why did he boast about the $100 million profit he expected to make on the deal? He sobbed at the mention of his son, and at one point he was forced to admit that he had refused to testify in a civil lawsuit because he did not wish to incriminate himself. But perhaps the most gripping moment came later, when the ghost of Doheny's dead son was summoned to testify. It was a masterful bit of courtroom theatrics orchestrated by the lead defense attorney Frank Hogan, who took Ned's place on the stand. He spoke Ned's words given at his father's conspiracy trial 3 years earlier. It was a surreal and emotional moment that served to remind jurors of the recent tragedy suffered by the frail oil man. It begged them to ask if he had not been punished enough for his sins. 3 days later, the jury was given the case. Deliberations lasted just over an hour, and the unanimous verdict was not guilty. It was a great irony that Doheny was acquitted for paying the bribe that Albert Fall was convicted of receiving. Doheny was elated at the outcome, and to show his appreciation to attorney Frank Hogan, he gifted him a Rolls-Royce touring car, as well as giving him the personal use of his 254-foot yacht, the Cassiana, to take on a month-long Hawaiian cruise. And on top of it was an estimated $1 million bonus. Hogan later said there is no better client than a frightened millionaire. With the nightmare of Teapot Dome finally behind him, Doheny focused on repairing his damaged reputation through charitable contributions. For his great generosity to the Catholic Church, he was made a Knight of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre by Pope Pius XI. However, the honor, just like his legal victory, was bittersweet. The death of his son left a deep, festering wound that would never heal. He was desperate that Ned's name would be remembered for something besides infamy and murder. So in 1931, he began his last great project to build a permanent memorial to his late beloved son. In June of that year, he broke ground on the Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr. Memorial Library at Ned's alma mater, the University of Southern California. Work on the structure lasted 15 months, and in September 1932, Ned's son, E.L. Doheny III, handed the keys to the library over to the school. To this day, it remains the intellectual and cultural center of the university. By 1935, E.L. Doheny's health was in decline, and he rarely left his Chester Place home. On one rare occasion, he paid a sentimental visit to the site of his first oil well in Los Angeles. In 1892, it produced a modest 40 barrels of oil per day. Those humble beginnings sparked an oil boom that transformed an obscure, dusty pueblo that was known as a refuge for people afflicted with tuberculosis into one of the greatest cities in the world. It remains his most lasting legacy. Edward Lawrence Doheny died at home on the 8th of September 1935 at the age of 79. As with Ned, his Requiem Mass was at St. Vincent's. His eulogy was given by the Bishop of Los Angeles, J.J. Cantwell, who praised the oil man for his hard work and beneficence. He lauded him as a patriot, but overlooked the fact that his dealings caused Americans to lose faith in their government. The bishop spoke of his devotion to family, but left out how he used his son and his son's friend as bagmen in a shady transaction that eventually cost them their lives. Or how in an unholy charade he allowed his murdered son to be called from the grave to bear witness on his behalf. After the church service, pallbearers carried his casket to a waiting hearse. The funeral cortege made its way to East Los Angeles, passing towering oil derricks that seemed to stand in reverence for their former master. Doheny was taken to Calvary Cemetery, where his casket was placed on the forecourt of the recently completed mausoleum. From high atop columns, angels watched over the private gravesite mass attended by family and close friends. At the head of the main chapel is a marble altarpiece depicting the crucifixion of Christ. To the right of this work of art is a private family vault. Here, Doheny's oak casket was entombed within a crypt decorated with fine Italian marble. There is no epitaph or emblem or list of accomplishments inscribed on the stone, just simply Edward Lawrence Doheny, August 10, 1856 to September 8, 1935. Above is Carrie Estelle, who joined her husband in death on the 30th of October, 1958. Their lives, as all lives, were filled with complexities and paradoxes, but theirs, more than others, have been left open for strangers to decode and interpret. It's clear that Doheny understood this, and perhaps it is why on the eastern wall of the tomb there's a stained glass window depicting the Holy Mother. A halo encircling her head is inscribed with the Catholic prayer of intercession that reads, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." Leslie White left the Special Investigations Unit around the time Old Man Doheny went off to his reward. His experiences at Greystone on that cold February morning played a major part in his decision to quit. He began to see the system he worked for as inherently corrupt, and the moral code he lived by told him that if he stayed too long, he would be no different than any crooked cop on the take. He had been quietly polishing his writing skills and contributed stories to detective magazines. It led to a 4-decade career as an author. He wrote dozens of pulp fiction novels and screenplays, including the aforementioned autobiography. Me Detective gave readers a glimpse into the favoritism and iniquity of the justice system. Although it was not a bestseller, its influence was far-reaching. Legendary crime fiction novelist Raymond Chandler was fascinated by the Doheny murder and wove its twists and turns into several of his detective novels. It appears most notably in his 1942 classic, The High Window. In it, the recurring protagonist Philip Marlowe recalls the cover-up of a murder-suicide involving the son of a multimillionaire named Cassidy.
"Now what did you do with the Cassidy case?" Breeze sighed. "Murder and suicide during a drinking spree. The secretary went haywire and shot young Cassidy. I read it in the papers or something." "You read it in the papers," I said, "but it wasn't so. What's more, you knew it wasn't so, and the DA knew it wasn't so, and the DA's investigators were pulled off the case within a matter of hours. There was no inquest, but every crime reporter in town and every cop on every homicide detail knew it was Cassidy that did the shooting, that it was Cassidy that was crazy drunk, that it was the secretary who tried to handle him and couldn't, and tried to get away but wasn't quick enough. Cassidy's was a contact wound, and the secretary's was not. And why were no tests of the hands made for nitrates? Because you didn't want the truth. Cassidy was too big."
Chandler's fictional version reads almost word for word what Leslie White described in Me, Detective, right down to the detail of the burned-out cigarette found in the dead secretary's fingers. But where White only opened the door on speculation, Chandler charged in and flatly indicted the late Doheny as the killer. It helped push the tragedy into the realm of pop culture, where it has lived ever since. Over the decades, it has spawned both plausible and wild theories. Most agree with Chandler that Ned was the one who suffered the mental breakdown, and indeed there have been whispers that he, like his biological mother, battled depression and substance abuse. And although these are not markers for violence, he was known to demonstrate erratic and sometimes dangerous behavior. For instance, during the construction of Greystone, he could be seen in the mansion's unfinished upper floors with a rifle. From a sniper's perch, he shot at deer and coyotes roaming the hills, sometimes sending bullets screaming over the heads of workmen. At times, his volatile mood swings forced Lucy to separate him from the rest of the family. More recently, stories have emerged that Hugh and Ned were secret lovers. Surviving members of the Plunkett and Doheny families concede there is a possibility the men were gay. Rumors stem from their close bond and the time they spent together in the years prior to the tragedy. Some theorists allege that Ned's wife killed them after finding out about their love affair. However, the most plausible theories center around Hugh's impending testimony at the elder Doheny's bribery trial. It is suspected that he was under intense pressure to commit himself to the Patton State Hospital, the pretext being that he was experiencing a nervous collapse. While there, he would be safely out of reach of the anticipated subpoena. On February 16, 1929, the day of the shooting, Ned and Lucy paid an afternoon visit to Hugh at his rented home in Los Angeles. Lucy confirmed this later, stating that they were concerned about his well-being and advised him to take time off. However, he became so upset at the suggestion they were forced to call Dr. Fishbaugh out of fear he may harm himself. If true, it doesn't really fit in with the facts, because there is evidence that at the same time Hugh was already prepared for an extended trip. Receipts show that he had serviced his car and purchased everything one would need for a long absence. But before he left town, he made the fateful decision to visit Greystone. The other piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit is Hugh's supposed nervous collapse. He had no prior history of mood disorders or insomnia, as was reported by the Doheny camp. His family and roommates said he had been slightly nervous about the subpoena, which is understandable, but he was otherwise perfectly normal. It is unknown why, if he was leaving town, he made a detour to Greystone, but it could hardly have been with the intent to commit murder. By all accounts, Hugh had every reason to want to live. He had a close and loving relationship with his family. They described him as good-natured, charismatic, and willing to help anyone in need. This is evident by the fact that he was financially supporting his parents and paying for his brother Robert's engineering degree at USC. Upon his death, all of that ended in an instant. Afterward, the Plunketts were not convinced that Hugh was capable of doing what they said he did. Robert especially wanted answers and went to the DA, the police, and the press, but everywhere he turned, he came up empty-handed. In the end, all they got were flowers from the Dohenys to adorn Hugh's casket. They even offered to buy graves for the entire family near his, but they could never tell if it was an act of kindness or a warning. We see the lives of those who have gone before us as if looking through a glass darkly. In the high window, after Philip Marlowe finishes his speech about the Cassidy case, a weary Detective Breeze asks rhetorically what difference it makes who killed who, since both men were dead anyway. Marlowe is surprised by his callousness and wonders if he has considered that the secretary might have had a mother or a sister or a sweetheart who were left with the memory that the man they loved and cherished was a drunken paranoiac, all because his boss's father had $100 million. When Raymond Chandler wrote those words, he touched the very heart of the Doheny tragedy. All too often, people are remembered only for the way they died, and so it goes with Hugh Plunkett and Ned Doheny. There is no living memory of who they were before tragedy entered their narratives, making them enigmas. Even Ned's grandchildren know almost nothing about him. Lucy Doheny remarried in 1932 to investment banker Lee Batson. Curiously, the wedding ceremony took place at Greystone on the 3rd anniversary of the tragedy. The couple continued to live in the Beverly Hills mansion for the next 20 years, where she raised her 5 children. Lucy was a strict and demanding woman. She never spoke of Ned, nor did she entertain discussions or questions about him, especially in matters concerning his death. It was as if she wanted to erase all memory of her first husband, which has left a void in his heirs' understanding of where they came from. Lucy moved from Greystone in the 1950s and lived to see 100 birthdays. It was said in the last years of her life she would dress every day in her finest and sit in a chair with her handbag at the ready, as if waiting for someone or something that never came. The aura of silence enveloped the Plunkett family in much the same way. They were never the same after Hugh died. Robert could not come to peace with what they were told happened. He wanted to fight for his brother's memory, but his parents would have no part in it. It was not because they had given in, but because some wounds are just too painful to bear. Hugh's mother passed away 2 years later and was buried near her son at Forest Lawn. She is the only other member of the Plunkett family to be laid to rest in the plot gifted to them by the Doheny family. Nearly a century has passed since the events described in this video, and the big house on the hill above Sunset Boulevard still stands cold and hard against the sky. Today, Greystone Mansion belongs to the city of Beverly Hills and is used for public events and the occasional movie shoot. Visitors today are drawn to the small south guest room, where on a misty February night in 1929, 2 men died. They come out of curiosity and in the quiet hope of finding an answer that will never come. Most of the time, the house sits empty, silent, a mausoleum of memory. It was never a home, but a fortress that keeps its secrets. Thank you, my friends, for watching to the end. Please share in the comments what you think happened that night at Greystone. I look forward to hearing from you. Until we walk again, stay well.